What if Brian Laundrie is never caught? The tragic story of the homicide of Gabby Petito has taken the entire world by storm, and the biggest questions that still remain unanswered all center around the still yet to be found primary suspect of Brian Laundrie. Last seen by his parents on September 13th before allegedly leaving with a backpack, Brian had 4 days of a head start before a federal manhunt began, with him being wanted for both potential debit card fraud and questioning in regards to the disappearance of the girlfriend he'd been traveling with for months before unexpectedly returning home alone on September 1st. Searches in recent weeks have all been primarily focused on the T. Mabry Carlton Jr. Memorial Reserve, most commonly known as simply the Carlton Reserve. At over 25,000 acres or 100 square kilometers, the reserve is a vast forest filled with hiking trails, swamps, and a multitude of different biomes to potentially hide out within. Other than the trails, the area is extremely inhospitable, which has made doing a thorough sweep of the entire reserve a tricky operation to pull off. Brian is also alleged to be a heavy outdoorsman, with months' worth of experience hiking and camping in areas like the Appalachian Trail. In fact, the primary reason the Carlton Reserve is being treated as such a high likelihood of a location for Brian to be hiding out in is because of how much he loved the outdoors and the upper hand in hiding he would have in an area that he knew well, given his family's frequent trips to nearby parks. At the time of this video's recording, it has been 3 weeks since law enforcement began officially searching and sweeping the Carlton Reserve for evidence of Brian, a task which is steadily getting a bit easier for them as some of the water in the swampier areas is beginning to recede, leaving more traversable ground to navigate larger search teams. However, the fact that Brian has yet to be caught after 21 days of searching means he's either doing an incredible job of staying hidden in the wilderness, or he somehow managed to escape the area despite many in America knowing his name and face. If Brian is never caught in the woods, his options outside of the reserve within society would be very, very few. Modern culture and businesses rely so much on official identification and digital infrastructure already, to say nothing of the sudden rise in businesses requiring ID and vaccine passports. Brian would be essentially cut off from utilizing much of civilization. Even if he wasn't recognized by anyone he directly talked with, any attempts to use a credit card, access money, or contact home would definitely be immediately pinged by the police. Maybe half a century ago, someone could get away with changing their name and trying to start a new life in a different town, but there's simply too much digital baggage and too much of a big national story made about Brian Laundrie and Gabby Petito. His chances of being able to avoid detection and reintegrate into society are essentially at zero. His only hope would be remaining completely off the grid, a near impossibility in this day and age. Meanwhile, if Brian does continue to evade authorities within the Carlton Reserve itself, the question of whether something bad will happen to him becomes a when instead of an if. While Brian's backpack may have initially had enough provisions of food and water to last him until now, those reserves would surely be running low by this point in the search. While it's possible if he was thinking far enough ahead that he could have packed a small water filtration system to allow him to continue drinking from local rivers and ponds, food would be a much more pressing issue. There's not much sustenance he could safely hunt or forage for within the Carlton Reserve without having to utilize making some form of fire. Getting sick off of raw rabbit would be a potentially fatal mistake, but any attempt at making fire would also be a clear sign to any search groups of Brian's current location, or at the very least have his fire pit discovered sometime later and confirming his general location to the authorities. Making a fire and boiling water would also be his only way to produce clean drinking water if he didn't pack a dedicated filtration system with him, meaning that the longer he stays out in those woods, the longer he risks either getting found out for making a fire pit or having far more fatal consequences from refusing to cook or boil his sustenance. Eventually, if Brian is never found because he does completely commit to staying off the grid or has had something happen to him in a location that won't be easily found for a long time, the police will have to lessen their approach. Search teams will get smaller, shifts will get shorter, and eventually the list of leads will have dried up. More missing people's cases will come forward, as unfortunate as it might be, and eventually priority will need to be given to other cases, other suspects, and more recent occurrences. All of the info gathered will obviously remain on file, and if any more evidence does begin to appear again, if Brian Laundrie did eventually try making a life for himself in a new town, any suspicions could get confirmed by this data kept on file. But police forces only have a certain amount of budget to delegate to manhunts, and especially given the difficulty of the terrain that Brian is alleged to be hiding in, and eventually the case will have to be considered cold. While other avenues of information or even other suspects in the Gabby Petito case may arise, Brian is by far the primary suspect. All of the evidence and circumstantial details of the story point in the direction of Brian, and even if he somehow didn't commit the murder himself, finds his actions incredibly suspicious and without explanation as to why he wouldn't tell anyone about his missing girlfriend. Without Brian, the search for answers becomes much, much harder. However, just because a case has gone cold and become a lesser priority for law enforcement does not mean that the case is entirely hopeless. The story of Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie has already been filled with independent detectives and the public itself becoming vastly interested in their disappearance story, and with so much curiosity already shown towards them, it would be foolish to think that everyone would forget about their story overnight if the official investigation ever ceases to play out. Just recently, headlines were made across the world when a group of independent investigators appeared to make a breakthrough in the long-dormant and mysterious case of the Zodiac Killer, a serial killer who terrorized the San Francisco area in the late 1960s and had long been assumed to be one of the world's greatest unsolved mysteries. Nobody had been able to definitively figure out who the Zodiac Killer was in nearly 60 years, to the degree that Hollywood movies were made about the mysterious circumstances surrounding the case, and yet, suddenly, a group of dedicated but independent people were able to allegedly make a breakthrough. Now, it's still too early and the story too fresh to definitively say if their accusation towards Gary Francis Post, a man who passed away 3 years ago and is thus unable to defend himself, is concrete or not, but the evidence they've put forth is compelling. Furthermore, the point is that mysteries and unsolved murders don't just disappear. There will always be someone curious enough to keep searching and keep trying to put the clues together to figure out just what happened to Brian Laundrie and how he was able to avoid the authorities so well and why he was inclined to do so in the first place. Whatever winds up happening, we just hope that justice is eventually able to be found for Gabby Petito and that the mystery of Brian Laundrie's disappearance will be solved. With everything going on in the world, people need to hear some good news. So what do you think will happen with this case? What other videos would you like to see from us? Let us know down in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons to keep up to date with the channel. I've been Josh Busker, and this has been Life's Biggest Questions.